It is so nice to see all of you here. I'm Maria Wolf, President of the World Affairs Council, and it is a great pleasure It is a particular pleasure tonight to welcome you to Women Changing the World. As most of you know, tonight is the first of 4 lectures in this year's International Speaker Series, and for the first time in the 14-year history of the series, all the presenters are women. And each of those women is absolutely changing the world. We will be introducing tonight's very special guest in just a few minutes, but I hope you will also join us on April 23rd for Khalida Brohi. Khalida is distinguished in many ways. She's a young Pakistani, only 24 years old, the youngest person we've ever had in the history of the Speaker Series, but already at this tender age has already impacted the lives of many thousands of people. Following Khalida on May 8th is Leymah Gbowee, who won the Nobel Peace Prize in 2011. She organized a nonviolent movement of Christian and Muslim women in Liberia to overthrow the despot Charles Taylor and end the Liberian Civil War. She is also the mother of 6 children. Perhaps the most difficult task of all, right? Yeah. The final speaker on May 27th is Hung Huang, often referred to as the Oprah Winfrey of China. She is CEO of China Interactive, a huge media conglomerate, and is a blogger with 6 million followers. Time magazine listed her as one of the 100 most powerful people in the world. We are extending the Women Changing the World theme well beyond the speaker series and into the community. There's a flyer in your program tonight that lists some of the things we'll be doing. These range from a video contest for high school students, and if you haven't entered, you high school students out there, there's still a week or so to do that. There'll be a conference for 200 educators and film showings and much more. Please keep checking the council website because we're adding new things all the time. It is a genuine honor to thank our sponsors who make all those council programs as well as this series possible. Of course, there's Nike, our lead sponsor since 2002. I don't even know what I can say about them. But they are wonderful, and we do love them. Portland State University has been an invaluable partner for many years, for many council programs. We're grateful to our series supporters, Delta Airlines, Wells Fargo Bank, the Heathman Hotel, as well as our media sponsors, the Oregonian and Oregon Public Broadcasting. We are also grateful to an amazing group of individuals. These are the change makers whose personal sponsorship supports not only the series, but many community programs offered by the council. They, along with corporate supporters and community friends, are all listed in your program. We can't thank them enough. Now, the usual admonitions: please turn off your cell phone, and of course, no photographs or recordings. If you have a question for our speaker, and I imagine you do, please write it on the card provided and pass it to the aisle. The ushers will be patrolling the aisles throughout the evening, and they will collect the cards. It is a pleasure to now introduce the chair of the World Affairs Council Board of Trustees, Hans van Allebeek, who is Executive Vice President for Global Operations and Technology at Nike. Please join me in welcoming Hans, who will introduce tonight's speaker.
Apologies, I was talking to Madam Secretary and we kind of got lost a little bit there. But thank you all for coming in such large numbers. It really shows that Portland and Oregon is interested in world affairs, that the theme of Women Changing the World is connecting with you. And of course, the star power of tonight's speaker may have helped a little bit as well with you coming. Before I do her introduction, I want to make a quick sidestep and thank somebody else. And for several decades, the World Affairs Council of Oregon has been connecting Oregonians to the world through the terrific programs, and some of which you saw earlier. The International Speaker Series has already existed for 14 years. Many renowned international leaders such as the Dalai Lama, Gorbachev, Bono, and the first President Clinton were at So Maria's dream was to have an all-women series. She always struggled to find at least one woman, maybe two women in the series. She wanted to have an all-women series, which today it's becoming a reality. And you should note that this series sold out more quickly than any of the prior series. Including the one I might add with tonight's speaker's husband, but she won't tell him that. I've personally worked with Maria for the past 5 years and with her team, and I have to tell you, I've worked with a lot of teams across the globe, but the passion, perseverance, and professionalism that Maria and her team bring every day is second to none to what I have seen. So we're really lucky to have her and her team in our community, and just maybe a brief, quick applause for them. Now, my role is to introduce tonight's speaker. I assume Maria already said who I was. In case not, I'm Hans van Allebeek. I'm the chair of the World Affairs Council for this year. But as I said earlier, really Maria does all the work and her team. So my role is to introduce tonight's speaker, the Honorable Hillary Rodham Clinton, former Secretary of State and Senator from New York. This may seem a relatively easy job because most of you know a lot about her already. But I've read a few books in the last few days, and trying to put that in 2 minutes is no small task, I can tell you that. But I'll try. Let me start with something Ms. Clinton said. She said the difference between a politician and a statesman is that the politician thinks about the next election, while the statesman thinks about the next generation. Nowhere does this ring more true than in nearly 4 decades of public service as an advocate, attorney, First Lady, Senator, and Secretary of State. Most of us got to know Ms. Clinton in the campaign leading up to and after becoming First Lady in 1992. And it was clear that she was a strong person in her own right, with opinions, causes she cared for, and a willingness to take a leadership role. For example, she wrote the HRC Quarterly Issue, the First Lady to have her own national publication, and she spearheaded a healthcare reform. Probably ahead of its time, but revolutionary nonetheless. And she published a book, It Takes a Village and Other Lessons Our Children Teach Us. But even before she moved into the White House, Ms. Clinton already had a distinguished career where time and again she took leadership roles, displayed a keen interest in politics, and in many cases broke new ground for women. Growing up in Chicago, she ran for class president. While she didn't win, it was too much of a man's role at the time. She was asked to lead the organization committee, which really did most of the work, a theme that will follow later. She left for Wellesley after that as one of the first kids from her area and graduated in political science. And perhaps a little-known fact to you is that she ran for and became president of the Republican Club, an early indication of her ability to work across the aisle. At graduation, she was the first student ever to address the graduating class, where she delivered a passionate plea to illustrate the trust gap that exists between the young people and the establishment at the time. This was the time of the Vietnam War, and the indispensable task of constructive protest. She went on to attend Yale Law School, where she graduated with honors, and then after a stint teaching at Arkansas Law School, she joined Rose Law Firm in '76, where she made partner in just 3 years and was later recognized as one of the 100 most powerful lawyers in America. After the White House, Clinton made history as the first First Lady elected to the United States Senate. She worked effectively across party lines to expand economic opportunity, provided access to quality, affordable health care, and secured more than $20 billion for the rebuilding of New York after September 11. After that, she ran for the Democratic presidential nomination, where she became the first woman to win a primary. As the 67th Secretary of State, Clinton aimed to restore America's standing in the world and strengthen its global leadership through a smart power approach to foreign policy. Some examples include reasserting the United States as a Pacific power, imposing sanctions on Iran and North Korea, and responding to challenges and opportunities in the Arab awakening. She traveled to more than 80 countries. I tend to complain about jet lag when I've been to one, not her. Winning respect as a champion of human rights, democracy, and a civil society. Today, Clinton continues to build on the nonprofit work she began nearly 4 decades ago through the Bill, Hillary, and Chelsea Clinton Foundation, including her latest initiative, No Ceilings, the Full Participation Project, which brings together organizations to accelerate full participation for women and girls in the 21st century. Because to paraphrase her, for too long, too many women in too many countries have spoken the same language, one of silence. Her current role is listed on Twitter as TBD. Perhaps she will shed some more light on her next step tonight. If one looks back at Clinton's career, 3 attributes come to mind. Ambition for making the world a better place. Advocacy for women's rights and equal opportunity. And tenacity. She sees things through to the end. She can be knocked down, but she gets up and continues to fight. She has been an inspiration to women and girls and men across the globe. Please join me in giving a warm welcome to Ms. Hillary Rodham Clinton.
Thank you all very, very much. Thank you. Thank you all. It is great to be back and to have this opportunity to spend some time with you. I was especially delighted and just a little bit jealous as I saw that spring has already come to Portland, something that we're still waiting for in New York. I want to thank Hans for that very kind introduction. He reminded me of things about my life that I had tried to forget going back decades. I also want to thank Maria Wolf and look forward to talking with her, answering questions about matters that are happening in the world and any other related concerns. And I really thank all of you way up there in the top. I'm looking forward to an engaging and hopefully exciting, insightful evening. You know, this World Affairs Council here has a great reputation, not only because of events like this, which bring people to hear speakers, but also because of the work that the Council does in the community, working in schools, working with the international visitors programs, bringing delegations from across the world here to Portland, introducing our culture and learning more about others' cultures. And I think we need more of that in our country. We have a lot that we can learn from each other and a lot that we can give to each other. So, Portland, give yourselves another round of applause for what this represents. Now, since I left the State Department, I've been working on a book about my experiences as Secretary of State, about the rapidly changing, increasingly interdependent world that we see around us, and the challenges and opportunities facing our country, from Crimea to climate change. Just another light summer read that I hope you will pick up just to while the hours away. But I'm writing about many of the same pressing issues that the World Affairs Council brings to the attention of the community, as well as to students and teachers, leaders and lawmakers here in Portland, in Oregon, and around our country. I was wondering how to just compress 4 years of experience in actually 112 countries, nearly 1 million miles, into a presentation. And I hope you're ready for a long evening. I am willing to order voodoo donuts for everybody. You know, those sugar highs can keep us going to breakfast. But what I think I'll do instead is say a few words about one of the pressing issues that we're watching unfold in Europe, and then talk about what the theme for the World Affairs Council is this year, namely women's advancement and empowerment. And I'm especially looking forward to that part of the program because, having heard the list of speakers that will be coming here this year, you have a real treat in store for you. When my staff called and asked Maria and the others at the council, what should I talk about, they said, well, women, of course, which I would have done anyway, but also maybe a few words about Vladimir Putin. Now, keep that in your head. This is kind of cognitive dissonance writ large. So I'll start with Putin. You know, I said often that Putin is a tough guy with a thin skin. And he has cherished for years a vision of a greater Russia. His vision for the future is to drag his country into the past. And it's not exactly a winning strategy, but it does cause some heartburn along the way. I said when I was secretary and was watching his moves that he wanted to re-Sovietize Russia's periphery, what is called often the near abroad, namely those independent nations that were once part of the Soviet Union and/or the Warsaw Pact. And he's never gotten over the collapse of the Soviet Union. What should have been seen as the liberation of the Russian people, he saw as a calamity, a catastrophe of historic proportions. And he has been obsessed by that ever since. The invasion of Georgia in August of 2008 made very clear that he was not going to be influenced, let alone deterred, by international law, by territorial integrity and sovereignty of a neighboring nation. But it wasn't just that we closely watched and analyzed. He's also begun to reopen old Soviet military bases across the Arctic, threatening to militarize that fragile, pristine region. Greenpeace activists who were protesting drilling by Russian companies were arrested and held for weeks. In Europe, he has used every bit of leverage he could to keep former Soviet republics from building ties to the West. He's banned imports of wine from Moldova. He's boycotted dairy products from Lithuania. He's cut off gas not once but twice in 2006 and 2009, principally targeting Ukraine. And of course, within his own borders, he has cracked down on the press, on dissidents, on civil liberties. To take one of many examples, under his leadership, Russia has enacted, for the first time, a series of anti-gay laws prohibiting the adoption of Russian children by gay couples or any couples from countries that allow marriage equality, making it a crime to promote gay rights or even discuss that around children. Now, I had some quite heated discussions with my counterpart, Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, on many things. But on this one in particular, we had an argument over a dinner table in St. Petersburg about what Russia was trying to achieve by criminalizing their gay citizens. Now, Lavrov is usually a quite cool character, but on this topic, he turned mean-spirited. He began insulting the United States, saying that Russians didn't have a problem with homosexuals, just with their propaganda, and that they were going to deal with that. I said, Sergei, have you been to the Hermitage lately? Have you been to the Bolshoi? Have you been to the symphony? Have you been to a gallery? Have you been to the streets? Have you been anywhere in this city of St. Petersburg? Why are you doing this? Because it was part of Putin's vision of how to reassert greatness, nationalism, which to him meant marginalizing, discriminating. His way of doing business within Russia and with other countries seems more like a page torn from 1914 rather than 2014. He sees geopolitics as a zero-sum game in which if someone is winning, then someone else has to be losing. And history teaches us this is a dangerous and counterproductive view of the world. While Putin tries to insulate himself to maintain and grow his own power, he is insulating his country. Other nations are racing ahead by being constructive partners and contributing to an interconnected global economy. While he limits the rights and participation of his own people, oppresses journalists, goes after minorities, countries with open, inclusive societies are flourishing and innovating. So while we always need to deal with the challenges presented by out-of-touch plutocrats and power-hungry troublemakers, we also need to focus on those areas that present opportunities as well. Money is fleeing Russia, but so are talented people who are seeking a better life, better opportunity in Europe, in the United States, Canada, elsewhere. That is a losing proposition for Putin, to see the resources, human and monetary, fleeing his country. So we do have to be vigilant, and I'm sure we can talk about that more in the question and answer period, but it's not enough just to focus on the dangers. we also need to expand our horizons. We worked hard in the first term of the Obama administration to reassert America as a Pacific presence and a Pacific power. We knew very well that the next few decades will have a huge impact on the growth of the global economy, the spread of human rights, and security around the world, depending upon what happens in the Asia-Pacific. More than half the world's population lives in the vast region from the Indian Ocean to the island nations. Here we find some of our most trusted allies and valuable trading partners, many of the world's most dynamic trade and energy routes. A few years ago, when our country was struggling through the worst economic downturn since the Great Depression, American exports to the Asia-Pacific helped spur our recovery. Our future growth will get a real shot in the arm if we reach farther into the burgeoning consumer markets across the region. But this is like preaching to the choir, talking about this in Portland, because Oregon has already made tremendous strides looking west across the Pacific. In 2011, this state had the second highest economic growth rate of any state in the United States. Partly because of the close economic ties you have forged over years with Asia. More of your agricultural exports land on Japanese shores than in any other country. China is your largest trading partner, and with an eye toward the future, students in your classrooms are learning English and Mandarin. I think that is exactly the kind of open embrace of the future that we want to see more of, not just here, but across our nation. On my first trip to China in February of 2009, we had a very long agenda on all of the issues that you can imagine, from North Korea to Tibet. And as I was in the midst of the meeting, the Chinese foreign minister said, "We are so sorry that the United States will not be participating in our International Expo in Shanghai in 2010, the next year." I'd been really well briefed. Nobody had said anything to me about the expo in Shanghai. And you learn in these positions, you know, to look like, oh yes, of course, the expo. And I said, well, what is it that really concerns you about that? And he said, well, the only two countries not building pavilions are Andorra and the United States. I said, well, let me look into that. And I raced back to the hotel and started calling people. What is the Shanghai Expo? Oh, it was something that the prior administration delegated to a group that is out of money, and they didn't really pull together the corporate sponsors, and it's too late. I said, it can't be too late. I mean, I keep picking up all of these translated articles from the Chinese press talking about the decline of the United States. We can't not be there, just us and Andorra, for heaven's sakes. We have to have a pavilion. So we hustled around and we got one built, finally. I actually went back to Shanghai to make sure that it was being built, stood in the rain, an umbrella over my head, and talked about how wonderful it was going to be when it actually was finished. And then I went back in May of 2010 to visit it. And it was with a great sigh of relief that it was actually there. And a lot of iconic American companies had really come through for us. Lots of wonderful examples of our innovations and the cutting-edge technology that marks our country. But the most impressive part were the American students who volunteered to serve as hosts and guides. They represented the full diversity of our country from every walk of life. And they were all chosen because they spoke Mandarin. And the Chinese visitors, because that was obviously where most of the visitors were coming from, all throughout China, stood in line, and our American students went and spoke to them in their language so enthusiastically. They told jokes, they swapped stories. That kind of personal contact can do so much for the US-China relationship. And I saw that in action. And you are on track here in this state and this city to take full advantage of a 21st century economy and to help make sure that the United States remains a strong presence and a power in the Pacific. But as we look ahead, and there are so many other issues from the Middle East and North Africa to changes in Latin America and Africa to so many other questions. But let me just focus on one area that could continue to undermine the progress and prosperity that is possible globally and nationally. And that's the focus of this year's International Speakers Series, Women Changing the World. You will hear from trailblazers, Leymah Gbowee, who is a Nobel Peace Laureate who helped lead a movement of women to end the conflict in Liberia. And if you have not educated yourself on what she and President Johnson Sirleaf and others did, please do before you come to hear her speak. And in particular, I recommend a movie about what women did to bring peace to Liberia called Pray the Devil Back to Hell. It's inspiring, it's emotional, and it will give you a sense of what that poor country went through until the women in Liberia, Christian and Muslim together, said enough. This conflict, this horrific violence that has stalked our land must end. You will also hear from Khalida Brohi, a young Pakistani social entrepreneur who aims to end the horror of honor killings and to promote economic opportunities for tribal and rural women in Pakistan. Pakistan is, in many ways, the most difficult and dangerous country that I dealt with as Secretary of State. A nuclear-powered country, a country riven by an insurgency from the Pakistani Taliban, a country whose military has dominated the society for decades and remains on high alert because of the hostilities with India, a country that has failed to invest in its own people, and a country that can neither be embraced nor ignored. And you will hear from one of China's greatest women entrepreneurs to give you some insight into the extraordinary economic change that has gone on there. So I'm delighted to be one of the 4 women as part of this important series. And it's crucial that we think hard about how to advance the rights and opportunities of women and girls, the unfinished business here at home and around the world. As First Lady, as a senator, then Secretary of State, I had the chance to travel on behalf of all of you. I've met with women from every walk of life and learned that women everywhere have much more in common than what separates us. Aspirations for good jobs, healthy families, strong communities. The drive to be entrepreneurs and builders, agents of change, drivers of progress, makers of peace. During the 1990s, when my husband was focused on helping the people of Northern Ireland overcome centuries of distrust and sectarian division and decades of the so-called Troubles, I worked with the women of Northern Ireland, both communities, bringing them together to encourage them to stand up for peace. I brought leaders from both sides, Catholic and Protestant alike, into a big meeting in Belfast. They sat on opposite sides of the table, not looking at each other, barely looking up. And I waited, and I waited. And then finally one of the women said, "You know, I'm here because I'm tired of worrying about my son every time he goes out at night, whether he'll come back alive in one piece." And then a woman on the opposite side of the table looked at her and said, "Well, I'm here because I worry about my husband going to work every morning, whether he'll come home alive and in one piece." And then they began to talk across that divide, across that table, for the first time ever. Women are now poised to become full participants in their societies and their economies. We've made important progress in recent years. Today, more girls are in school, in primary school, where we've closed the gender gap. It still divides after primary school. More women in places where they're permitted to serve in public office. More contribute to the formal economies of their countries. But too many still face ceilings that hold back their ambitions and aspirations, that make it harder for them to fulfill their own potential. Believe it or not, participation of women in the global workforce has actually stagnated over the past 3 decades, dropping from 57% to 55%. More than 100 countries still have laws on the books that limit women's roles in the formal economy. In some places, women cannot open a bank account or sign a contract. In others, women are restricted as to what professions they can enter and what hours they can work. Now, you might think this is only a problem in faraway places, developing countries, but in the United States and other advanced economies, women still earn 16% less on average than men for the same work. Only a small percentage of Fortune 500 CEOs are women. In the United States, women hold less than 17% of corporate board seats, far behind many other developed economies. In Norway, for example, it's more than 40%. Now, these ceilings don't just keep down women and girls, they hold back entire economies and societies. And that is because no country can truly thrive by denying the contributions of half its people. Now, when I first made this argument, and I think I first made it when I was about 4 years old to my mother, but when I first made it publicly, I rooted it in a sense of injustice, a sense of morality, It was just wrong that girls were not given the same opportunities as boys. And I came of age at a time when there were a lot of scholarships and schools that girls couldn't go to. So I saw that, I experienced it. But in recent years, I've rooted the argument somewhere else. I've rooted it in the economy. Because now we have evidence that when women and girls participate throughout the economy, productivity and growth go up for everyone. Now that has not been widely known because we didn't have the data, we didn't collect it, and we certainly didn't analyze what we did have until recently. A recent report from the International Monetary Fund found that further increasing female labor force participation would increase the gross domestic product in the United States by 5%, in Japan by 9%, in the United Arab Emirates by 12%, and in Egypt by 34%. We're all trying to figure out how we get the global economy and our own economy to move more quickly, to create more jobs. Think about what 5% additional GDP would mean. Now, American women went from holding 37% of all jobs in the United States 40 years ago to nearly 48% today. If you just look at that 40-year period and the increase in women's labor force participation, the productivity gains attributable to this increase accounts for more than $3.5 trillion in GDP growth. Now, we know that when women participate in politics and government, the effects ripple out across societies. For example, one study in India found that villages led by women have more clean drinking water, child immunizations go up, there's a lower gender gap in school attendance, and there's less bribery. Now, I can't tell you how many times I've sat across the table from some high-ranking official in some country, a president or a prime minister, whose eyes glaze over when I say, for example, "Don't you think you ought to let your women drive?" I don't want to get too radical here. How about letting them vote? How about letting them leave their house without a male relative? And many other examples. But when I raise the impact on the economy and what that would mean for their country, suddenly they're alert. I was very pleased when Prime Minister Abe came into office, and because of this data and a speech that I had given at the Asia-Pacific Economic Community preparation session, people around him were looking into these figures, and as part of his economic plan to try to push Japan out of the stagnation, deflation that they have experienced, he called for more women to be in the workforce. And it was revolutionary. And he looked at the problems in the society and said, you know, we need greater productivity. We're not going to change our views on immigration. But we have this untapped resource, all these educated women. And then the educated women said, yeah, but we have to take care of the children and the aging parents. So what are you going to do about that if you want us in the workforce? So now there's a conversation that is long overdue. Creating these economic opportunities, giving women their education and health care, to enable them to go as far as their God-given potential and hard work will take them, is the most important unfinished business of the 21st century. Nearly 20 years ago, in 1995, I had the honor of leading the U.S. delegation to the UN Global Conference on Women held in Beijing. 189 countries came together and agreed on an ambitious platform for action that called for, and I quote, the full and equal participation of women in political, civil, economic, social, and cultural life. It was a call to action for the global community to work for the laws and reforms and social changes necessary to ensure that women and girls everywhere finally have the opportunities they deserve to contribute fully to the progress and prosperity of their societies. Now, nearly 20 years later, this work goes on. At the Clinton Foundation, which I joined after leaving the State Department to work with my husband and my daughter, one of the initiatives we have begun is called No Ceilings, the Full Participation Project. And that is to bring a new generation into the fight and chart a path forward for the next 20 years. We're collecting the best data and research available on the progress women and girls have made and what more needs to be done. What are the gains and what are the gaps? And we are partnering with dozens and dozens and dozens of other organizations, multilateral organizations, individual organizations, even some here in Portland that we hope to have engaged in our work with us. We want progress to take hold at every level. And we could never have imagined, we certainly did not foresee, what has happened with technology, how people communicate today, what we know, what we can learn. And I'm hoping that we will be able to use technology to push this agenda forward into places where it can take root and flower. I appreciate greatly what goes on in this community and this state. It is encouraging to see a lot of the dynamism and energy that is not just focused close to home, but looking much further out. Seizing opportunities, putting down those roots in markets that will underpin growth and prosperity, connecting up cultures and sharing knowledge and understanding in classrooms and communities. The innovations that are being pioneered and driven right here in Portland are important for a wide range of issues, but they're also critical to how far we get in the full participation for women and girls. As I've been writing this book and thinking back on all of the people that I have met, particularly as Secretary of State, many stand out. Some were new friends, some were long-time friends. I remember going to Nelson Mandela's inauguration in 1994. He was someone whom I had admired from afar, who I had in organizations I was a part of, taken positions against apartheid, who I had watched walk out of prison. And I was thrilled to be there. And his speech was extraordinary for many reasons. But one was that he mentioned the need for equality for women. Fast forward to the inauguration of Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, President of Liberia. When she was inaugurated, she stood before the crowd and paid tribute to those market women, those activist women who had made it possible for her to become the first woman elected president of a country in Africa. For people who have struggled, who have seen the worst of humanity, as both Madiba and Ellen had, there is no time, there is no room for discrimination of any sort. There is too much work to be done. People must get over the divides that separate us and keep finding ways to bring us to common ground. Great leaders do that. We see it. But it's not just the responsibility of leaders. Whether we talk about racism or homophobia or any form of discrimination and prejudice, including sexism, the battle must be fought day by day by every person of conscience, of caring, who recognizes and accepts our common humanity. For me, it's been an extraordinary honor to serve my country for so many years. And I ended my time as Secretary of State more convinced than ever that what we do here to keep widening the circle of dignity and opportunity not only will make us stronger, but will send out those ripples east, west, north, and south that will give more people everywhere a chance to live up to their own God-given potential. Thank you all very much.
We'll get to that later. Thank you very much, Madam Secretary, for a wonderful presentation. We have a large collection of questions. We can only get to a few of them, I'm afraid, tonight, but let's start with this. Barack Obama had to work hard to persuade you to become Secretary of State. Apparently, you declined his invitation several times. Why were you reluctant, and why did you finally accept?
Well, I write about this in my book because I also declined my husband's first offers for marriage. So there seems to be some kind of pattern here. I'm not quite sure. But eventually, you know, they're both very charismatic. They wore me down. When I ended my campaign in June of 2008, it had been, in case you might have forgotten, a very, very intense, exhausting experience for everybody. And I was looking forward to going back to the Senate, and I was certainly going to do everything I could to support our nominee and to make sure that he was elected our president. So when that happened, I think my husband and I did 100 events between June and November, supporting him and then supporting the ticket with Joe Biden. I was elated and I was relieved, and I just wanted to kind of slow down, go back to the Senate, work on behalf of New York, which, starting with 9/11, it had a pretty rough decade. So I was not expecting anything. And when the president-elect called and said he wanted to see me, there were rumors in the press, which I did not give much credence to, having been the subject of a lot of rumors in the press over a lot of years. I figured, I mean, the one on Postmaster General, I thought, well, maybe. I've always been interested in that. But so when he said he wanted to see me, I told everybody, it's ridiculous. He's not going to offer me anything. He wants to, make sure that I'll support his agenda in the Senate and everything. So when he said, I want you to be Secretary of State, I said, well, that's not a good idea. There are so many other people. I really don't want to do that right now, thank you. And he just wouldn't take no for an answer. And we had a number of very in-depth conversations. Look, he was facing such a set of inherited challenges, 2 wars, a disastrous economic recession, just on the brink of depression. And he said, I have to focus on the economy, which of course was the case. He said, but I also need to reassure people around the world, so I need somebody like you to go do that. And I did say no a couple of times, and then I finally thought, well, suppose the roles had been reversed and I had won and I were asking him to please take this position. Of course I would want him to say yes, because I would want to move on to other problems and not have to worry about that. So I did eventually tell him that I would be honored to serve, and it was a great decision and an amazing experience. And we not only became good professional colleagues, we developed a real friendship, and that meant the world to me. So it was hard to leave when I said I was going to leave after 1 term, but that was the right decision because it was time for me to kind of move on. But I finally got around to saying yes.
What is one aspect of global politics and America's role in the world that you believe most Americans do not understand, and what would you like them to know?
Well, that climate change is a national security problem, not just an environmental problem, and that we have to not only lead in taking steps in our own country on an expedited, urgent basis, but we have to do the same globally. Any of you who have either read or read about the recent UN report that has just come out in the last week, you can see the patterns of weather changing and the impact on food production and distribution, which is a perfect segue into greater instability and conflict. So when I was in the Senate, I am no expert, believe me, on this, but it seemed to me that just as geography really matters in world affairs, that weather patterns historically have, and if the predictions about climate change were credible, then we had to start thinking about it as a national security issue, and I sponsored a little amendment that asked the CIA and the Defense Department to start doing assessments, and in fact, even then, some years ago, we were seeing the impact. Now it's even more dramatic. So I know that people think about it as an economic issue or an environmental issue, but I wish more Americans would understand it is a security issue, and it's something that we are going to have to come to grips with.
You were known to advocate arming rebels in Syria early in the recent conflict, but the plan was opposed by the White House. What do you think should be done now?
Well, I have a chapter about, about Syria in my book because it's one of those problems that it's very hard to take a side on and say that you're 100% or mostly right and another side is wrong, because the factors are incredibly complicated and multi-layered. And I worked in the State Department on the diplomacy concerning Syria, but I also spent time discussing what possibly could be done with my colleagues on the National Security Council. And we did make some proposals about trying some different approaches that might possibly put more pressure on Assad, might not, it was a calculated assessment, in order to bring about a greater willingness on the part of the Assad government to enter into serious negotiations for a political resolution. But with Russia continuing to supply very significant arms to Assad, with Iran sending in not only Iranian Revolutionary Guard members, but also putting their proxy Hezbollah into the battle, it was a difficult challenge to sort out. So now I think we are seeing that the rebel forces have been, unfortunately, infiltrated by various extremist jihadist groups that are not fighting for a democratic Syria, which the original rebels claimed to be, but for gaining safe haven, gaining advantage, basically holding territory that can be used for their own purposes. So the predictions about all of the dangers that could happen have happened, and we never got a chance to try any different approach. However, it is a singular accomplishment to be removing the chemical weapons out of Syria. They're now up to over half of the weapons, the stockpiles of the precursors being taken out, and they will be destroyed. So that is a positive, but I think the conflict is now just going to grind on, and it will continue to cause floods of refugees into neighboring countries. It will continue to exacerbate the Sunni-Shiite split. So it is a wicked problem, and it is a very hard one. There's some things that I feel strongly about and believe, we either did the right thing or there was something else we could have done. Syria is a much more complex issue to take that kind of stand on. So we are where we are right now, and we have to try to figure out how to balance the parity, or try to get, you can't get to parity, but to balance the forces a little bit so you can put some pressure on Assad. But with Iran and Russia supporting him so strongly, I think that's very difficult to do.
There is still no equal rights amendment to the U.S. Constitution. Here in Oregon, there is an initiative movement to get an amendment to the state constitution on the November ballot. How important is the ERA, both nationally and at the state level?
Well, it would be nice to be in the Constitution. And so, some of us remember the battle over the national ERA, and we were quite close to getting the necessary number of states to recommend its inclusion in the Constitution, and then, just a flood of horrible consequences that would occur because of that were publicized and argued over, and it just stopped people in their tracks. So some people say, well, it's only symbolic. Well, yes, but symbolism is important, and it can also be a great message and even lead to actions that further equality. So I think if you can have that kind of debate here in this state, you might be starting something beyond your borders. So I would be interested in seeing how that turned out.
Yeah. I should tell you, if you haven't already noticed, that there are signature gatherers outside for this petition, so you might want to check into that afterwards. What is it like to have lived most of your adult life in the public eye, with every move scrutinized and often criticized, sometimes brutally?
Well, what do you think? It takes some getting used to. I lived, a good part of my life before that happened, even when Bill was governor of Arkansas, which was a small state, and everybody, pretty much knew each other. There wasn't the hot spotlight. I drove my own car. I went to work. I picked up my daughter after school, took her to ballet class, went out with my friends. It just didn't rise to the level of breathless, scrutiny that now stalks not just people in politics, but people in all kinds of public arenas. And it gives you a sense of being kind of dehumanized, I guess, as part of the experience. You really can't ever feel like you're just having a normal day, and you have to get over that. You have to just make up your mind you're going to live your life the best you can, and it takes some planning and some thought, but it can be done. But you never forget that you're, in that public arena. I don't think it's particularly good for the country because it isolates people in public life. It isolates them by, putting them over in a special category where people stare at them as though they're some kind of, new breed of human being. And for some people, that's discomforting and it's anxiety producing, but for other people, they begin to think, well, maybe they are. And, if everybody's so interested in what you had for breakfast and, what your hair looks like and all the rest of that, well, gee, that's kind of a good deal. And so people become, so cut off from reality and from just everyday life. So it's a two-way street. When people are put on that hot box with the glare of the spotlight, it can be quite discomforting. And at the same time, it can also create a separateness that is not good for our political system. So I've learned to just kind of go with the flow, so to speak. That's hard won after many years. It didn't happen quickly. I follow Eleanor Roosevelt's advice to, if you want to be in the public arena, grow skin as thick as a rhinoceros, and that seems to work. And to take criticism seriously but not personally, which is hard, but I highly recommend it, because then you can sort through whatever the criticism is, and if it's legitimate, and I hate to admit it, but some of it is, then you can learn from it, because your critics can actually be your friends, because they will tell you things that your true friends may not. So there are ways of learning how to cope with it, deal with it, but it's getting more and more out of control, because now everybody has a cell phone with a camera, so you're never away from it. It's just constant. And I don't know quite what that's doing to us, and not just people in the public eye, but to everybody. I think we'll have to wait a generation or so to find out. But it's something that, I've gotten accustomed to and pretty much adapted to.
As we approach the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, many historians and politicians speculate that it would be highly unlikely for it to pass today in the current climate of political and social polarization, campaign money, 24-hour news cycles. What do you think?
Well, I think that the Civil Rights Act of 1964 would pass. I think it would be a heavy lift. I believe it would pass the Senate. And then we'd have a real fight on our hands in the House. But I'm not so sure the Voting Rights Act would pass. All of these moves to restrict the franchise, to make it so difficult for poor people, young people, rural people, African Americans, Hispanics to vote is quite distressing. And so I think that the basic structure of the civil rights legislation would pass, but I think that it might be more difficult with some of the additional legislation that really put a lot of meat on the bones of the original act. Now, the Johnson Library in Austin is having a big gathering, I think maybe tomorrow, because my husband, I think, will be there along with the other living ex-presidents. To honor Johnson and to honor the accomplishments of his civil rights legislation. So I do think that we're at one of those strange moments we go through in our political history where we're kind of rushing around. I keep quoting this alleged quote by Winston Churchill. Some people say he said it, other people say he didn't say it. I prefer to think he did say it because it's so perfect, but that you can always count on the Americans to finally do the right thing after trying nearly everything else. Sounds very Churchillian. And so I think that we need to be reminded of times when important actions were taken on behalf of the common good. Just last weekend, there was a celebration of George H.W. Bush's presidency, and a lot of what we take for granted, he was responsible for. Extending things like the Clean Air Act and other environmental issues that right now would be difficult to get through. So I think we have to take stock of the fact, and I saw Mrs. Hatfield here earlier. Antoinette was here somewhere. I don't know where she is in this crowd. That we had bipartisan support for important legislation until relatively recently. It took a long time to break the hold of the Southern Democrats in the Senate to get the civil rights bills passed, but eventually that was successful. Other major pieces of legislation, even when Bill was president, and working on budget deals and deficit reduction. The first time around in '93, not a single Republican vote. By the late '90s, an agreement that balanced the budget, produced surpluses, and it's just the hard work of not giving up, of going back, of being tenacious, of finding what people want. Compromise is essential. It is not a dirty word, and it has to be valued in a democracy.
A recent poll showed that Americans viewed cockroaches, lice, and colonoscopies more favorably than they viewed Congress. what can be done to restore real respect to this legislative body?
Well, it's probably a good sign that people are favorable toward colonoscopies. If you're over 50, you need to be serious about that. Look, I think there are three big challenges when it comes to what's happening in Washington. And some of them are the responsibility of leaders, and some are, frankly, the responsibility of citizens. The first is, to pick up on what I said at the end of the last answer, don't vote for people who proudly tell you they will not compromise. And understand that you can be a liberal, you can be a conservative, but you want to vote for somebody who understands, respects, and cherishes the democratic process. And that means that they cannot believe they have all the answers. That politics is a matter of ideology or even theology. That they are the mouthpieces for vested interests, not for the citizens who elected them. And so I think on this issue, whether you're a Democrat, a Republican, or any other variety of political affiliation or belief, talk with your friends, think through, if you're conservative, getting a conservative who will actually have an agenda that understands he may not get 100%, but through the process may be able to move his own beliefs forward. Or, on the progressive and liberal side, the same. Secondly, don't give these people money. It only encourages them. And, with the rate the Supreme Court's going, there'll only be like 3 or 4 people in the whole country who have to finance our entire political system by the time they're done. But still, a lot of people participate, which is good, but be prudent about who you support and make it clear that, it's important that, your vote, your voice, your financial support go to people who will, certainly pursue their political beliefs. That's absolutely expected. But to do so without ripping down the institutions. Now, I was in Hong Kong in July of 2011 on a pre-planned trip, and I was supposed to be giving an economic speech to a very large business group in Hong Kong, predominantly Chinese, Hong Kong Chinese, mainland Chinese, but other Asian and Western interests. During the time when the first debate about the debt ceiling was going on. And by the time I got to Hong Kong, the papers I could read, the English language papers, were just incredulous. The United States is going to default on their debt. The United States is going to undermine its full faith and credit. What does this mean? And that was all that these business leaders wanted to talk to me about. And, I reassured them. I said, well, we're having a bit of a political discussion back and forth, but at the end of the day, we will do what we need to do and will not precipitate a global financial unraveling. Well, that turned out to be the case, and then I breathed a big sigh of relief. So we went through that again last fall, as you recall. And this time, I followed some of the foreign commentary because I was interested. The first time, they were just disbelief was the primary reaction. This time, it was contempt. You know, there was a series of comments coming out of the Chinese, and the most telling theme running through it was, it's time to de-Americanize the world. It's time to have a different reserve currency. But it wasn't just the Chinese. Even some of our best friends were saying things like, we can't live with this unpredictability. I mean, the country went through it, or the world went through a terrible economic period just a few years ago. Doesn't anybody remember that? We need stability, we need predictability. But de-Americanize the world really caught my attention. Moving away from the dollar as the reserve currency. These have consequences. You know, there are a lot of people around the world who follow American politics really closely. And what we do matters to them. And it's not just a game where, you know, somebody gets up and pontificates about this, doesn't even seem to understand that the debt limit is to pay the bills they've already voted for. It has nothing to do with cutting spending in the future. It's just like two apples and oranges difference. So I think that the stakes for how we govern ourselves, for our economy, for our democracy, are really high, because there are a lot more countries with a lot more means to undermine our presence, and if they think it's in their interest to do so, we'll begin that process. And then the final thing I would say is what leaders need to do. You know, leaders need to get back to good old-fashioned negotiating. They have to have more incentive to get to know each other again. I was very proud of your neighbor, my friend Patty Murray, and the deal that she worked out with Paul Ryan last fall. It wasn't a perfect deal. It wasn't what he would have written or what she would have written if they had been left to their own devices, but they actually got to know each other. They spent time talking through what their priorities were. And that has been diminishing. It's even less than it was when Bill was president. You know, Newt Gingrich would spend all day attacking Bill on TV, often attacking me as well. And then he'd come over to the White House at 9 o'clock and they would start negotiating. But now there's so much less of even that kind of personal trust building, which is so essential to making any kind of deal. So I think there's work to be done, but at the end of the day, we can't blame anybody else. We have to make our own decisions about what we're going to do, and we have to then hold leaders to the standard that we'd like to see them fulfill.
For our last question this evening, we have one from a student at Glencoe Elementary School. This is Zola Semper DeMarco. She is 6 years old. She addresses this to Mrs. H.R. Clinton. And she says, in 2016, would you prefer to be called Madam President or Mrs. President? Thank you and good night. Yes.